The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on me as I sat at the dinner table, methodically slicing my steak. Across the room, Travis paced back and forth, his agitation radiating off him in waves. His footsteps were sharp, erratic, like he was barely holding himself together. It had started, as always, with his sister, Lauren. Another crisis, another plea for money. This time, she needed help paying her rent, and as usual, Travis expected me to cover it. I had laughed, not cruelly, just incredulously, and gone back to cooking. That was all it took for him to snap. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his hands clenched into fists. "You're really just gonna sit there and act like it's funny? My sister is struggling, Joan. She's about to lose her apartment, and you don't even care." I sighed, cutting another piece of steak. "Travis, we've been through this. We've given her money before, and what happens? She just needs more. You and I work for our money. She doesn't. That's not my problem." His jaw tightened. "It's called family, Joan. Something you wouldn't understand." I shrugged, taking a bite, unfazed by the way his voice was rising. "Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand that you're more worried about her bills than the fact that we have our own expenses." His patience snapped. With no warning, he grabbed his wine glass and flung it at me. I barely flinched as the red liquid splashed across my face, staining my white blouse. It pooled onto my plate, mixing with the juices of my steak. For a long, stretched-out moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, methodically, I wiped my face with a napkin. Without a word, I finished my last bite of food, picked up my plate, and placed it in the sink. I didn't look at him as I walked past, the smell of wine clinging to me. Travis didn't say anything either. Maybe he was shocked at his own actions. Maybe he expected me to react, yell, scream, cry. But I did none of that. I just walked away. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The anger, the blame, the way he lashed out when things didn't go his way, it had been growing for months. The first time he raised his voice at me, I had chalked it up to stress. Work had been brutal, his job was demanding, and Lauren was always asking him for favors. It was just a rough patch, I had told myself. The second time, when he slammed his fist against the counter because I had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning, I had paused. The third time, when he had called me ungrateful because I didn't want to cancel my plans to babysit his sister's kids, I had begged *N to see the crux. And now, here we were. A glass of wine. A ruined blouse. A silence that said more than any argument ever could. That night, while Travis slept, I packed a suitcase. My documents, keys to the spare car, the emergency cash I had hidden away, everything was ready. I stood in the dim light of our bedroom, looking at him for what I knew would be the last time. His face was slack with sleep, peaceful, as if he hadn't just crossed a line he could never uncross. I thought about the years we had spent together. The good times, the laughter, the moments when I had convinced myself that he loved me too much to ever truly hurt me. But love wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like walking on eggshells. Like having to justify every decision I made. Like carrying the weight of someone else's responsibilities while they took me for granted. And it sure as hell wasn't supposed to feel like the sting of wine against my skin, the sharp smell of alcohol filling my nose as my husband glared at me like I was the problem. I exhaled slowly, gripping the handle of my suitcase. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe him one. By the time the sun rose, I was gone. I didn't take the predictable route. Travis knew me well enough to guess where I might go. A hotel downtown. My friend Hannah's apartment. My parents' house a few hours away. So I did none of that. I got in the car and drove straight out of Chicago, heading south with no real destination in mind. I stopped once to grab gas and a cup of coffee, checking my phone only long enough to turn off my location tracking. By the time morning arrived, I was in Indianapolis. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place with a flickering neon sign and a front desk clerk who didn't ask too many questions. I paid for a week in cash, no credit card, no paper trail. Inside the room, I locked the door behind me and finally let out the breath I had been holding since I left. The walls were thin, the sheets scratchy, and the TV barely worked. But for the first time in months, I felt safe. The first thing I did was buy a new SIM card for my phone, switching out my number before Travis could even think about calling me. Then I logged into my bank account and transferred everything into a separate account I had opened months ago under a different name. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start over. I had been preparing for this for longer than I wanted to admit. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. Travis would wake up soon, and he would realize I was gone. I wondered how long it would take before the panic set in. Would he call me first? Or would he call Lauren? Would he be angry? Would he even care? I laid back against the lumpy pillows, staring at the ceiling. It didn't matter. I was free, and I wasn't going back. Travis woke up to silence. At first, he must have thought I was in the kitchen, making coffee like I always did. Or maybe he assumed I had left for work early. But then, as the minutes stretched on, he must have noticed something was off. No sounds of the shower running, no clatter of dishes in the sink, no faint hum of the radio I usually played while getting ready. It probably wasn't until he rolled over and saw the empty space beside him that the first flicker of unease set in. I imagined him walking through the apartment, his brows furrowed, his mouth twisting into that annoyed scowl he always wore when things didn't go according to plan. Maybe he called out my name a few times. Maybe he checked the bathroom, the closet, the front door. And then he would have seen it. The bare hangers where my clothes used to be. The empty drawer where I kept my jewelry and personal documents. The absence of my shoes by the door, my purse on the entryway table, my laptop on the desk. His phone must have been in his hand within seconds. First, he would have called me. Straight to voicemail. Then again. Same result. Panic. Maybe he checked our shared bank account, only to realize the money was gone. Maybe he scrolled through my texts, trying to find some kind of clue. Maybe he even went to the building security desk, asking if they'd seen me leave. I wondered how long it took before he called Lauren. I imagined her groggy voice on the other end, still half asleep. Travis? What? Slow down. What do you mean she's gone? The clock on the motel nightstand read 8:22 a.m. I took a slow sip of the coffee I'd picked up from a gas station that morning, the bitter taste grounding me as I pictured them trying to put the pieces together. Maybe Lauren told him to relax. Maybe she said I was just cooling off, that I'd be back in a few hours. But Travis wasn't stupid. He would have felt it in his gut. This wasn't just a fight. This wasn't me needing space. I was gone. And I wasn't coming back. The first text came at 8:37 a.m. Travis, Joan. Where are you? I stared at the screen for a long moment before placing my phone face down on the nightstand. I wasn't going to answer. At 8:45 a.m., another text. Travis, this isn't funny. If you're trying to prove a point, you made it. Come home. At 9:02 a.m., a call. Straight to voicemail. By 9:15 a.m., the messages had changed tone. Travis, you're being ridiculous. Running away over a stupid argument? Grow up. Travis, call me. Travis, fine. Be immature. But don't expect me to come chasing after you. I let out a slow breath, stretching my legs out on the motel bed. The covers were thin and scratchy, the kind of fabric that felt like it had been washed too many times without ever getting truly clean. But none of that mattered. Because I could breathe. Because I was alone. Because, for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next outburst, the next demand, the next moment when my life wasn't really my own. By 10:30 a.m., Travis had stopped texting. I turned my phone off. I didn't check it again until later that night, when I was curled up in bed, staring at the motel's popcorn ceiling, listening to the muffled sound of a TV from the next room over. There were 4 missed calls. 3 from Travis. 1 from Lauren. A single text from her. Lauren, what the hell is going on? Travis is freaking out. Call me. I exhaled slowly, tossing the phone onto the mattress beside me. Lauren. Of course. I should have expected that. To her, I was the villain in this story. The cold, selfish wife who had abandoned her husband over something so small. She would never understand. She had never wanted to understand. In her eyes, Travis was the one who had always been there for her. He was the one who had helped her out of bad relationships, covered her rent when she blew through her paycheck, picked her up when she was stranded at some guy's apartment in the middle of the night. He had been her protector. So, of course, she would protect him now. I didn't answer. The next morning, I left the motel before the sun was fully up. I drove around the city, getting familiar with the streets, looking for places I could blend in. I stopped by a local diner and ate a quiet breakfast, my mind going over what I needed to do next. I would need a job. Something simple. Something that paid cash at first, at least until I figured out my long-term plans. The idea of starting over from scratch was daunting. But it also thrilled me. By noon, I had found a tiny rental unit on the edge of the city, a one-bedroom in a rundown complex with thin walls and an old heater that rattled when it turned on. It wasn't much, but the landlord didn't ask for anything except first month's rent in cash, which was exactly what I needed. I signed the lease on the spot. By 3 p.m., I had a mattress on the floor, a few bags of groceries, and a cheap coffee maker from a second-hand store down the street. It was a far cry from the home I had shared with Travis. No marble countertops, no stainless steel appliances, no framed wedding photos on the walls. But for the first time in years, it was mine. And that was enough. That night, after I had locked every door and double-checked every window, I finally checked my phone again. There was only one new message. Travis, you'll regret this. I stared at the words for a long moment, my fingers hovering over the screen. Then, without hesitation, I deleted the message. I wasn't afraid of his threats. I had spent years living in the shadow of his temper, his guilt trips, his constant need to make me the bad guy. But that was over now. Travis could spiral. He could rage. He could blame me for leaving. It didn't matter. Because this time, I wasn't coming back. Travis didn't show up right away. I had braced myself for it. I half expected him to track me down within the first few days, to see his car parked outside my new place, or hear his voice demanding to be let in. He was the kind of man who didn't like loose ends, and I was supposed to be his. But days passed. Then a week. Then 2. At first, I thought maybe he had given up. Maybe he had decided I wasn't worth the effort. Then, one evening, as I left the small diner where I had picked up a waitressing job, I saw the familiar black sedan parked across the street. Travis's car. A cold weight settled in my stomach, but I kept walking, my fingers tightening around my purse strap. I didn't stop. Didn't turn my head. Just kept my eyes straight ahead, like I hadn't noticed him. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and stood there, heart pounding. I peeked through the blinds, my breath caught in my throat. The car didn't move. For 20 minutes, I watched it sit there, engine off, windows tinted too dark to see inside. Then, just as quietly as it had appeared, it pulled away. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the landlord and paid for an extra lock on my door. I stopped using the same route home. I changed my work schedule. But I never saw the car again. Still, the feeling stayed with me, that creeping sensation of being watched, of being one step away from looking over my shoulder and seeing him standing there. Lauren had stopped texting. Her silence told me everything. She had chosen her side. Maybe she had convinced herself that I had overreacted. That whatever happened that night at dinner wasn't as bad as I had made it seem. Or maybe she knew exactly what Travis was like. And maybe that's why she didn't ask me to come back. I had expected to feel more alone. But I didn't. I worked my shifts at the diner, stacking plates and pouring coffee for tired truckers and chatty old couples. I walked to the corner store on my days off, picking out groceries for one. I sat on my small balcony at night, sipping tea, letting the quiet settle into my bones. It was simple, unremarkable, but it was mine. Then, on a cold Wednesday afternoon, everything changed. I was refilling the napkin dispensers when my manager, Carla, came up to me, her lips pursed. "There's a guy asking for you," she said, jerking her head toward the entrance. Didn't give a name. My pulse jumped. For a split second, I thought it was Travis. But when I turned, I saw someone I hadn't expected. Lauren. She stood just inside the door, wrapped in a thick coat, her face pale. Her eyes flicked around the diner like she wasn't sure she wanted to be there. I set the napkins down and walked toward her, my footsteps slow, cautious. "What are you doing here?" I asked. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was trying to find the right words. Then she exhaled sharply. "It's Travis," she said. I didn't say anything, just waited. She shifted on her feet. "He's not okay." I crossed my arms. "Not my problem." Lauren flinched like she hadn't expected that. Like she thought I would soften, would ask her to sit down, would say I missed them. She didn't know me at all. "He's been drinking a lot," she continued, ignoring the way my expression didn't change. "Calling me at all hours. Saying weird things. He's losing it, Joan." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm sure that's hard for you." She hesitated. "He still loves you." I stared at her, my body stiff. "That's not love, Lauren." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. We stood there in silence, the sounds of the diner humming around us, clinking silverware, the low murmur of conversations, the sizzle of a fryer. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. "He wanted me to give you this." I didn't take it. She sighed and placed it on the counter instead, sliding it toward me. "Just read it. If you don't want to talk to him, fine. But at least read it." I glanced down at the envelope. My name was written across the front in Travis's handwriting. I didn't touch it. Lauren lingered for a moment, like she wanted to say something else. But in the end, she just turned and walked out. The bell above the door jingled as she left. I stared at the envelope. Then, without opening it, I picked it up and dropped it into the trash. A week passed before I saw him. It was just after my shift at the diner, the sun sinking low over the city, casting everything in that golden light that made even the ugliest streets look beautiful. I had my jacket pulled tight around me, my bag slung over my shoulder, my mind already drifting toward the tea I would make when I got home. And then, as I rounded the corner toward my apartment complex, I saw him. Travis. He was sitting on the steps leading up to my building, his elbows resting on his knees, his head hanging low. His once neatly styled hair was unkempt, his face shadowed with stubble. The sight of him hit me like a punch to the stomach, not because I missed him, not because I wanted him there, but because I had spent so much time preparing for this moment, and now that it was here, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. Turn around? Keep walking? Pretend I didn't see him? But it was too late. His head lifted, and his bludge asterisk T eyes locked onto mine. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then he stood. I braced myself, every muscle in my body tightening, my fingers twitching at my sides, ready to run if I had to. But Travis didn't move toward me. He just stayed where he was, hands hanging limply by his sides, like he didn't know what to do either. "Joan," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't respond. He let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. I didn't know where else to go. I glanced around. A couple of people were walking past on the sidewalk, barely sparing us a glance. Good. At least there were witnesses. "You shouldn't be here," I said finally, my voice steady. Travis flinched. I just wanted to talk," he said. I stared at him. His face looked different, more hollow, more tired. Like he hadn't slept in days. "Not my problem." "Talk about what?" I asked, crossing my arms. His jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought I saw the old Travis, the one who hated when I questioned him, when I didn't just fall in line. But then his shoulders slumped. "I messed up," he muttered. I didn't say anything. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I keep playing that night over in my head. The look on your face when I threw the wine. I don't know why I did it. I don't know what's wrong with me." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I do." His gaze snapped up to mine. "You think this was just about the wine, Travis?" I said, my voice quiet but firm. "That was just the last straw. It was the way you treated me. The way you made me feel like I owed you something. The way you made everything about you." He exhaled sharply. I know. I know, and I hate myself for it. I almost laughed. No, you don't. His head jerked back like I had slapped him. If you really hated yourself for it, you wouldn't be here trying to make me feel bad for leaving, I said. You'd be fixing yourself. But you're not. You're just doing what you always do, trying to guilt me into coming back. His face twisted. That's not true. I arched a brow. Isn't it? Silence. Then his hands clenched into fists. Not in anger. Not in the way they used to when he was on the verge of losing control. Just in frustration. In helplessness. I don't know how to be without you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt nothing. Not pity. Not regret. Not even anger anymore. Just exhaustion. You're going to have to learn, I said. His eyes met mine, desperate. Joan, please. No. The word was final. Cold. And when I turned and walked past him, up the steps to my building, I didn't look back. I half expected him to follow, to call my name again, to keep pushing like he always did. But he didn't. By the time I reached my apartment and peered out the window, he was gone. Travis didn't come back. Not that night. Not the next day. Not the next week. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to show up outside my job, for my phone to buzz with his name, for some grand, dramatic gesture where he would try to pull me back into his orbit. But it never happened. And after a while, I stopped expecting it. Life moved on. I settled into a routine, early shifts at the diner, slow afternoons wandering the city, quiet evenings spent curled up with a book and a mug of tea. The fear I had carried with me for so long, that constant knot in my stomach, started to unravel. I slept better, ate better, breathed better. And then, one afternoon, I came home to find someone waiting for me outside my building. Not Travis. Lauren. She was leaning against the railing near the front steps, arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently against the pavement. The moment she saw me, she straightened, pushing off the rail with a sigh. You've been ignoring my calls, she said. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder. Figured that was a pretty clear message. Lauren scoffed. Jesus, Joan. You're still mad at me. I blinked. Of all the things I had expected her to say, that wasn't one of them. Still mad. I repeated. Lauren, are you serious? Her hands went to her hips, her expression exasperated. Look, I know things got messy, okay? But that doesn't mean you had to cut me out completely. I laughed. Actually laughed. Things got messy, I echoed, shaking my head. That's how you're framing this? Lauren rolled her eyes. Oh my God, Joan. What do you want me to say? That I should have defended you more? That I should have called Travis out? Fine. I should have. But I didn't think it was my place. I stared at her, my pulse steady. But it was your place to show up here now, out of nowhere, like we're just supposed to go back to being friends? She flinched. For a second, I thought she might actually apologize. That maybe, just maybe, she had come here with good intentions. Then she sighed, shaking her head. I came because of Travis. Of course she did. He's different now, she said. I don't know, Joan. He's quiet. He barely talks to me. He barely eats. I thought maybe if I what? I cut in. Came back? Fixed him? Made him feel better about what he did. Lauren's mouth snapped shut. I'm not his emotional crutch anymore, I said, my voice calm. That's your job now. Her brows furrowed, like she wanted to argue. Like she wanted to tell me I was wrong. But she couldn't. Because we both knew the truth. Lauren needed Travis. She needed him to be the big brother who cleaned up her messes, who bailed her out when she overspent, who swooped in and made her feel safe. And now that he wasn't capable of doing that, she wanted me to fix it. She had never cared about what Travis put me through. She only cared about what my leaving had done to her. You're not going to help him, she said, realization dawning in her eyes. No, I said simply. Lauren inhaled sharply. So that's it? That's it, I confirmed. She let out a bitter laugh. Wow, you really have changed. Yeah, I said, pushing past her toward my building. I have. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in years, I was done. Winter settled over the city in slow, creeping waves. The first snowfall dusted the streets in a thin layer of white, and the cold air bit at my cheeks as I walked home from my shift. The diner had been busier than usual, people escaping the chill, lingering over steaming cups of coffee, bundling up in heavy coats before heading back out into the wind. I liked this time of year. It felt like a reset. A quiet pause before the new year, before everything started again. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't dreading what came next. Lauren didn't come back. Travis didn't reach out. I had expected some final act, some desperate attempt to drag me back into his world, but it never came. Maybe he had finally accepted it. Maybe he had found someone else to latch onto. Maybe he had just given up. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I had built something for myself. It wasn't much, just a small apartment, a job that paid the bills, quiet nights spent alone, but it was mine. All mine. And I was happy. Until the letter arrived. It was waiting for me when I got home, tucked neatly into my mailbox. A plain white envelope, no return address, my name written across the front in a handwriting I hadn't seen in months. Travis. I stared at it for a long time, my breath clouding in the cold air. Then, without a second thought, I ripped it in half. And then in half again. And again. I let the shredded pieces fall into the trash bin outside my building and walked upstairs without a single ounce of hesitation. I didn't need to read it. I didn't need to hear his apologies, his regrets, his excuses. I already knew what it would say. But whatever Travis was looking for, closure, redemption, forgiveness, he wasn't going to get it from me. I was free. And nothing he could ever say would change that.